Hi everyone, in this video I'd like to talk about historicity and metafiction applied to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Hopefully this will cover my main interpretation of the entire series. I'll start by talking a bit about these two concepts, and then I'll go over some textual evidence that suggests that this applies to the Book of the Fallen. Let's start with metafiction, which is usually commonly defined as self-conscious fiction. Metafiction was popularized, gained some notoriety in the 60s and 70s with the late structuralist movement and then the postmodern criticism. However, it must be said that metafiction is nothing really new. There's evidence of early texts that have metafictional components, and I've picked actually probably the most renowned novel of the Spanish language, which is my native language, which has a very strong metafictional component. It's Don Quixote. In this novel, in one of the late parts of the text, the characters notice the fact that the first part of their adventure has become a very popular book in their reality, which is a very strong metafictional component. They realize that their adventures are a fictional book inside of their universe. Now, another book, a bit more recent, that I would like to present as an example is The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. It's usually considered to be literary science fiction. In this book, the Second World War had a different outcome than it had in our reality. In this branch, the Axis won, the Allies were defeated, and we follow a group of characters throughout their lives, and one of them, actually many of them, finds this method of divination in this book, and eventually, as the novel progresses, they realize that it's possible that their reality is a sort of logical impossibility, that there's no way that the Axis shouldn't have won, that the Allies should have won. And through this method of divination, they start thinking about how this reality will be. It's not very overt, but we as readers that know the actual outcome of this historical event realize that they are talking about our reality. There's another example I like from fantasy. It's Book of the New Sun by Wolfe. And in this book, in this series, we have Severian. Now, Severian is narrating his story from one very specific point to another. What I think that makes this metafictional is the fact that at some point we realize that Severian is probably lying about his journey. So we eventually conclude that what Severian is telling us is to some extent fictional. He's distorting what happened to him, perhaps to make himself look better or in a certain way, perhaps to make other characters look differently. Maybe he wants to highlight some elements and ignore others. So at this point we realize that there is Severian, the narrator, and then there is Severian, the fictional character inside of this fictional work. I'm sure there are many other interesting examples, but I believe this illustrates more or less what I'll be referring as metafiction. Now, the label self-conscious fiction can be a bit vague. Does this require that the narrator is fully aware that he's inside of a fictional book? Not necessarily. That's just one way of doing it. There are many other ways of doing this. What should be evident from these examples and this very basic definition is that this approach to fiction is interesting for a variety of reasons. The first will be that it allows to integrate the unreliable narrator in a very seamless manner. For instance, Book of the New Sun. The other element is that it allows to highlight any kind of criticism of our reality that the book is willing to make. Criticism in the context of general commentary of this conversation that fiction can have with our reality. The next component of this framework is the term historicity. The most basic definition is that historicity is the quality of something being historical. This something can be an event, a person, a character, or a place, a city. This historicity, this historical status is contrasted with, say, a legend or a myth. By extension, obviously, historicity can be viewed as the study of the historical value of the things we mentioned. Now, I'm sure the term can be used in a much more technical way. In particular, I believe that it's used in a slightly different context in the study of history and anthropology, mainly because it allows to study earlier texts or accounts in a more nuanced way. For instance, if one has an early text from a particular culture, the notion of historicity allows to take that source into account based on what we know that culture held as historical as truth. The examples I would like to present for the application of historicity has to do with Homer's Iliad, the Battle of Troy, and the city of Troy itself. At face value, it will seem that the Iliad is an entirely fictional account. Completely a fiction. The battle is presumed to be fictional. The city of Troy is clearly a legend, and so was the war of Troy. Now, the issue with this is that there has been evidence found of the ruins of the city that seems to be Troy. And there seems to be some kind of evidence that actually a battle took place there, more or less at the time that one will assume, that one will estimate based on the study of the poem that the actual battle took place. The interesting point with this example is that this revises the historicity of the city of Troy and of the battle for Troy that is described in the Iliad. Of course, this doesn't mean that everything in the poem becomes automatically historical. That's not the case. In the poem, of course, we have the Greek gods descending or ascending or whatever to fight in this war. But at least we see how this transforms the validity of the poem. It transforms from being a legend to being an account of something that was probably historical, but it's an account that has been adapted. Some poetic license has been taken by Homer to narrate this presumably historical happening. So I will say that in this case, the historicity of this city and of this event has been revised. Now, how does this apply to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I would like to cite some textual evidence that give us a hint on all these concepts. The first one is the short poem that introduces Gardens of the Moon. The poem is, now these ashes have grown cold. We open the old book. These oil-stained pages recount the tales of the fallen, a frayed empire, world without warmth. The heart has ebbed. Its gleam and light sparks are but memories against dimming eyes. What cast my mind, what hue my thoughts as I open the book of the fallen and breathe deep the scent of history? Listen then to these words carried on a breath. These are the tales of us all, again yet again. We are history relieved, and that is all. Without end, that is all. At first glance, one would assume that it's just an aesthetic choice by the author. One will assume that this contains no information whatsoever on the epic series that we are about to read. But this is not the case. What I would argue is that this gives very strong hints of the nature of what we're about to read. It sets the tone, and there's a good deal of information in it. Of course, this only becomes overwhelmingly evident as you finish the book. What are the parts that I believe are more relevant here? Well, this short poem seems to be describing someone somewhere opening a history book to read about it. So we automatically imagine a fictional world, and in this fictional world there is a book of history. This book of history is called the Book of the Fallen. And there's somebody here that's going to read about this historical account that presumably happened long ago because the ashes have grown cold. There's also something to be said about the fact that the choice of word here is history, not story. Namely, it seems to confer the status of historical to whatever happened here. And I find that curious, actually. This poem is mirrored by the short poem after the two epilogues of the Crippled God by the end of the series. And now the page before us blurs. An age is done. The book must close. We are abandoned to history. Raise high one more time the tattered standard of the fallen. See through the drifting smoke to the dark stain upon the fabric. This is the blood of our lives. This is the payment of our deeds, all soon to be forgotten. We were never what people could be. We were only what we were. Remember us. There is a lot of symmetry here. The book must close, whereas the previous poem was, now we open the old book. To me, at least, it seems that there is a very strong suggestion that everything in between these two short poems, everything in the middle, is the book they are talking about. And this book is a historical account into this fictional universe. So not only does this suggest a strong metafictional component in the series, it also suggests that at the level of this fictional world, this text is historical. There are other elements throughout the book that can be used to make the argument that validate this first impression. I'd like to go to Toll the Hounds to elaborate a bit more on this. Toll the Hounds is a novel in which the narrative voice is very unusual. Toll the Hounds is narrated by Krupp, a character inside of this fictional universe. Again, this fact suggests some metafictional component. There is a character that is telling his own story. So one concludes that he knows he's in a fiction, at least in some sense. Another piece of evidence around Krupp is the fact that he refers to himself in the third person. Now, of course, we can look at that and think that it's just a fun way of writing a character, or that it's all about his ego. But I'd like to think that the fact that Krupp speaks of himself in the third person is he acknowledging that there is Krupp the person and there's Krupp the character. And so he speaks about this character Krupp as if it was a distinct person than himself. What else do I find interesting in Soul the Hounds? When you look carefully at the way Krupp describes the events in this novel, it becomes clear that even if what he's describing has historical value, of course, within this fictional universe, there is a strong fictional component to it too. Just like the former example of the Iliad, it seems that Krupp took whatever happened in the Registan, in this fictional universe, and has adapted it to highlight some elements, some themes that he wants to promote. To be brief, I'll cite one particular, well, it's not a phrase, it's a detail that I alluded in a previous video on Soul the Hounds. It's when Harlow returns from the mines, he returns to the fencing school of Stony. If you remember that episode, Krupp says that Harlow says something without sound, and then he has all this conversation with his mother, and after that Krupp reveals what Harlow said. Now, how could Krupp know what Harlow said? It really doesn't make any sense that Krupp knew what this small kid murmured in silence before going into the school. So this has all the signs of being an ahistorical detail that was put there because he wants to highlight this concept of redemption. Of course, what Harlow says is to his already dead friend, "Look, this is my mother." So this is just one of the details that suggests that Soul the Hounds is not actually an objective historical account of some set of events that took place during that period. They have a nugget of truth. The account is inspired by something that happened in the fictional sense, but the actual account has been modified with what one would call poetic license to portray the events so that they support certain theme that Krupp, in this case, wants to highlight, wants to promote. As I mentioned in my Soul the Hounds video, there's a variety of them. There are themes of motherhood, of catharsis and reconciliation, of closure, of overcoming grief, perhaps even justice in the less righteous way. These are all things that Krupp potentially wanted to highlight with these events. With the events that he recounts. And this takes us to one additional discussion to be had here, is the notion of objectivity. Is there such a thing as objective history? Is it possible for the person that sits down to recount what happened? Is there such thing as subjectivity? In the academic world, we would like to think that yes, that's what history should be about. I'm sure that at least a part of this field believes that should be the case. However, the problem is that biases are very subtle things. A person could have individual personal biases, but they could also have cultural biases. And even if we don't go as far as talking about objective biases, we could think about assumptions that are very hard to work without. And these assumptions usually come not only from the society in which somebody lives, but even at a smaller scale from the academic culture or institution or group. So this focus on objectivity perhaps can be approached through a different manner, which is acknowledging, embracing subjectivity, accepting that each account is filtered through biases of one way, of one form or another, and then perhaps trying to do some sort of cross-examination, namely studying sources with different sets of biases, just to mention an idea. What seems to me apparent for the way in which Krupp narrates Told the Hounds is that he's embracing his biases. He's not disguising that he's telling a story, even if this story is actually based on something historical. Now for the most complicated part. Up to this point, having read Told the Hounds, one would assume that the entire Book of the Fallen has been narrated by Krupp. But here we arrive at a more complicated part of the book. It's the Crippled God. It's in the last stand when Camisot is reassembling his body, and the Marines that are guarding his body are catching a breath after one of the many assaults by the much larger army that has been attacking them. One of the soldiers makes a joke. It's actually, I found it really funny. Basically, the question pops up, so who are we fighting for again? And then somebody else's replies, everybody. And then the person replies, oh, no wonder we're losing. And this group of Marines that are facing certain death all start laughing. I found the scene to be very humanizing and powerful because that's something I've seen happen actually. One finds oneself in a very hard situation, in a tough situation, perhaps even life-threatening. And yes, people find the energy of coming up with a joke, and we all laugh at it. I don't know if it's a coping mechanism. I don't claim any sort of expertise in psychology, but I find this to be a very human response to a moment of crisis, even if it's not a very logical one, but it's very human. And that's precisely the response of the Crippled God, of Camisot. And to this, moved by this expression of humanity, there's some, well, it's not a short paragraph, but what he says is this: there shall be a book, and it shall be written by my hand. Will unseek the faces of 1,000 gods. None can do what I can do. Not one can give voice to this holy creation. But this is not bravado. For this, my Book of the Fallen, the only God worthy of its telling is the crippled one, the broken one. And has it not always been thus? I never hid my hearts, I never disguised my dreams, and I never lost my way. And only the fallen can rise again. And then he listened to the laughter, and suddenly the weight of those chains was as nothing. Nothing. Here it's the crippled God saying that he's going to write the Book of the Fallen. So after looking at those two poems before Gardens of the Moon starts and just after the crippled God has finished, this book that we have been reading, apparently it's the crippled God who has written it. Camisot, after he's no longer crippled, after he has returned to his whatever place he came from. That would make sense if we didn't have the Krupp component of Toll the Hounds. Although there is some other evidence throughout the book. The most overt one is the transition between House of Chains and Midnight Tides. By the end of House of Chains, Troll Sengar is talking with Onrak about how he ended up shorn. And he seems to be about to tell Onrak his story. Now, the transition after this exchange is Midnight Tides, where we see much of the story of Troll. There are many reasons to believe that Midnight Tides is not told from the voice of Troll. The most elementary one is the fact that we know that Troll died. So even if he told this story to Onrak, he could not have written it down. Besides, there is nothing in the voice of the narrator in Midnight Tides that suggests that it is the narrative voice of Troll. But it is still suggestive concerning the metafictional element here, that we are seeing stories told by characters in the series, or at least an approximation of them. So how does that fit with the crippled God being the one that wrote down the Book of the Fallen? I'm sure there are many ways of reconciling this. The way I like to think about it, although of course this is subject to revision after I reread the series for the first time. The way I like to think about it is that the crippled God is not, Camisot is not writing this book down by himself. He's being informed by some of the characters in the books. But he still is the one that decides what to write down. Now it's very clear in the excerpt that I mentioned. There shall be a book and it shall be written by my hand. So something like Toll the Hounds, I believe, is what Camisot writes down from the tale that Krupp narrates. He picks and chooses what and how from this account of Krupp he's going to write down. Of course, this preserves the fictional component, because whatever Krupp is telling the crippled God that happened, it's still Krupp adjusting history to create this fictionalized version of history. And then of course the crippled God writes down the way he sees fit. What I like about this interpretation is that it, for instance, explains why, say, in Toll the Hounds, even though we know Krupp is narrating an important part of it, there are sections in which it isn't evident that it is Krupp that is talking because of the voice. So this switch between one voice and the other is very easily explained by the fact that, well, you had a night of recounting tales by a bonfire. Krupp was telling the tale of Toll the Hounds, and the Crippled God wrote it down. So in parts, it is the voice of the Crippled God, and in some other parts, he just wrote down verbatim whatever Krupp said. This basically lays out my interpretation of the entire book and how these concepts of historicity and metafiction play with the Book of the Fallen. Now, the question is, why is this interesting or important? Because the first thing that one notices is that metafiction is never obligatory. We can always ignore the metafictional component of a story and read it as if it was just fiction, not metafiction. The thing is that this interpretation is so much more flexible in the things that in the parallels we can draw between the books and reality. The commentary on our reality becomes much more evident. And of course, from a purely intellectual point of view, it becomes much more fun to try to track all these layers of fiction moving around. An example of how can we use these concepts or this framework to look at the Book of the Fallen is, for one, take a character like Shadowthrone or Cotillion. If it is indeed the Crippled God that is writing down this account, in all probability he's painting these two characters in a good light, like they are some sort of heroes. Is that the case? Well, I try to be cautious always with using the term hero in an objective sense. In stories, not so much, but in history, I try to be careful with who I call a hero, because even individuals that are generally considered to be heroic in history, there's always a framework, a point of view that wouldn't paint these individuals as actually heroes. There's just too much bias, there's just too much assumption when you say that a historical character was a hero. So in the same way, something like the portrayal of Shadowthrone and Cotillion as objectively positive characters can be seen from another perspective that we don't have because we are reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen written by Camisot. We are not reading the Letherite Chronicles written by the Errant. Perhaps if we read the account of the Errant, we will see Ganos and Tavor and Shadowthrone and Cotillion in a more negative light. Or perhaps if some other character wrote an account of similar events, Shadowthrone will be seen as a tyrant that delivered a terrible massacre at Idkokan. So that's one way of looking at it. It means that Malazan, in this metafictional context, is probably a book that has been written to highlight certain themes. Think of the Crippled God being released. Camisot goes back to his place of origin, and he wants to write a book that, I quote, "It will be a holy tome and none other shall be needed." So he clearly wants to highlight certain values. Other possibility is that he is doing what I like to call history condensation to make the work more interesting. What's this history condensation? Well, you take noteworthy events that took place throughout a decade, and then you compress the time frame when you report they happen. So you have events that took place throughout 10 years, but you're narrating or reporting that they happened in just 2 years. Now, that decade might have been just a standard period of time in terms of the events that occurred. But if you do this compression, that gives you 2 years of very intense events, one in succession of the other. And of course, if you're turning that into a narration, it turns into a much engaging narration. So to summarize, that's my interpretation, my main interpretation of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's metafictional, as in it allows the possibility, if one wishes, to buy into this narrative construct of it being a fiction inside a fictional universe. And it is to some extent historical in the sense that I describe. I go back to the example of the Iliad, of Homer's Iliad, in that it certainly inspired in things that are historical inside of this fictional universe, but it is not necessarily an objective account of what happened. But then again, that's just accepting the fact that we're being subjective, as opposed to pretending that we are objective and not being objective. As I mentioned before, you can always just make a reading as if it was traditional fiction, the traditional as in not meta, and that should be fine. But I like to think about this kind of thing as like when you're beginning to play Sudoku. Let's say you go by the 3 levels of difficulty of Sudoku. As you play more, you reach a point in which the easy level of Sudoku becomes boring. You want something more challenging. And so you go by the medium level, and then you hopefully end up in the hard level. And I like to think about this kind of literary devices or structures in this way. Of course, there's nothing wrong with reading the series at the barely fictional level. But if you find this interesting, it's worth a try to dig deep into this kind of metafictional components, and even in thinking about the historical value in the fictional sense of things that are happening. It always gives you a window to hypothesize about how things are presented in the book and how they speak to reality, to our universe. That's basically all I have for now. I hope to talk to you all soon, and I hope you have a good day. Bye.